Hello, and welcome back to the FrameLab podcast. I'm Gil Duran. In this episode, we talk about an interesting new poll that backs up what Dr. George Lakoff has been saying for decades. Democrats need to talk more about freedom, and they need to emphasize how they are for the people, unlike the Republicans, who are for the wealthy, for corporations, and increasingly for Vladimir Putin. A new poll conducted by FutureMajority.org reveals that messages based on these frames are a powerful way to reach movable voters, that is, swing voters whose choice could be pivotal in 2024. Here's my talk with Stephen Clermont of Change Research, who conducted the poll. Well, Stephen, welcome to the FrameLab podcast. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Good to see you again, Gil.
Yeah, good to see you. So why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your background and about the Future Majority and Change Research?
Well, my name is Stephen Clermont. I'm head of polling at Change Research, and I've been working in public opinion research and for Democratic candidates since 1993. So I worked for many years as a phone pollster, and both for other companies as well as my own, and then joined Change Research in 2018 because Change Research was pioneering a new way of doing surveying online. We don't use panels. We don't call people on the phone. We do online advertising throughout the internet to recruit respondents and recruit representative samples, and also send text messages. This allows us to gather lots and lots of data at a really affordable price. And one of our early partners was Future Majority, which is a 501c4 organization that does like policy and political research to help Democratic candidates and office holders sort of navigate the political environment. And we have been one of their polling partners from the beginning. We've done like well over 200,000 interviews in swing states and swing congressional districts around the country. And the project that we just released was a look at sort of how we define who's movable, who's reachable in this election, presidential election, and who's not. And it's a combination of work that we did with all voters in Pennsylvania, Nevada, and New York swing, Republican-held swing congressional districts that we did in December, a poll we did with under 40 voters in Arizona, Michigan, sort of the swing Republican-held congressional districts, and Metro Atlanta, and a national poll that Change Research recently did just to sort of measure who's movable nationally and who's not.
I was really interested in your poll because in many ways the messages you were finding and testing matched a lot of what Dr. Lakoff has talked about over the years. And I was wondering if you could just give us a quick overview of this Pulse of the Nation report that you did here in February of 2024 and what prompted this big study and what were the main takeaways you found?
Well, we've been trying to figure out the right way to analyze this election. This election is going to be unique in a lot of ways, with a president running against a former president, both of which have large unfavorable ratings. And there's a lot of different ways of like who is the voter that we need to target? Is it people that are unfavorable, the double haters who are unfavorable to both candidates? We noticed in 2022 that really the swing group turned out to be voters who somewhat disapprove of the job that Biden is doing. Usually those voters move against a president's party in an election. And there's a clear difference between those who somewhat disapprove of Biden and strongly disapprove. People who told us they voted for Biden in 2020, but not voting him in 2024. And sort of working with all this data came up with a metric of movable voters who are people who somewhat disapprove of the job Biden is doing or not sure, because the vote is very decided among the people who approve of the job he's doing or strongly disapprove. Undecided voters in the 2024 election, and then a small group of people who say they're voting for Trump or Biden, who can say that they could change their mind and vote for someone else. And so much of political communication, particularly on the presidential level, a lot of it goes to people who are largely decided. And we wanted to look at a big enough group of voters who at some level are not committed. So this basically excludes all the people who say that they're voting for Biden or Trump, and there's no chance they could vote for someone else. And that is we sort of look at that and try to get the simplest metric with the sort of widest possible group who's movable, really see the difference on a whole variety of metrics of how they differ from the decided voters.
So when you say movable, we're talking about what some people call swing voters, or some people might call them moderates. I don't think that's exactly the case here necessarily. Tell us a little bit about who these voters are and what their characteristics are that they have in common.
Both in this data and in when I've applied this metric to other polling that I've done recently, this group is much younger. It's over 60% or more under the age of 50. It's less white. It's more Hispanic and Black than decided voters are. They are much more female. I think in every poll that we've done, about 60% are women. And ideologically, sort of among young movable voters, ideologically, almost none of them identify as conservative. 0% identify as MAGA. It's sort of a mix of progressives, liberals, and moderates. And in terms of about party ID, about 20% identify as Republican. The rest, about half, identify as Democratic, and then about 30% purely independent, not leaning towards either party. So it's the theory that I've had for a while is when we look at these public polls, the public polls everyone's been freaking out about for months now, it's sort of the framework of, well, Trump's either tied or leading and in the high 40s. And there's this psychology that in 2016 and 2020, there was a hidden Trump vote that is like these polls look bad now and they're going to get even worse because there's people who are really for Trump but won't tell pollsters that. And I think what I found in this that's sort of very clear is that there's a lot of evidence that Trump is maxing out in polling. People that are for Trump are saying that they are for Trump, but there's very little room for him to grow. And these movables, you can see that. Trump gets a very low percentage of these voters. He is very, very unpopular with them. And there doesn't seem to be much room for him to grow. I mean, he's sort of in the low single digits when you look at the 7-way vote between Biden and all the various third-party voters. And so that is basically the impetus. So if we can see that these voters can be moved to Biden, Trump is maxing out, it's a different way of looking at this election than it's currently being reported. And I think we can also see in the Republican primary so far, in pretty much every state, where Trump has been polling at has been about 2 or 3 points better than what he ends up getting. He's not getting any undecided Republican votes in the primary. And there's at least the people are decided on Biden and decided for Trump are there. But there isn't that much more room for him to grow. The challenge is just Biden is running against like people not voting and people voting potential third party.
So the interesting part, I think, for a lot of our listeners and readers is the 3 messaging points that you have distilled down from your interviews and talks with these movable voters, many of whom are young, a lot of whom are people of color. One of the 3 frames to advance the Democratic agenda is that Joe Biden fights for the people, while Donald Trump fights for himself. Democrats deliver for the people, while MAGA Republicans are extremists, and that Democrats stand for freedom, democracy, and a better future, while MAGA Republicans stand with Trump and Putin. You also found that some of the messaging in the House leadership for House Democrats has been effective with their For the People agenda. And you also point to the need to not just run against a politician or center politicians in the debate. You say that doesn't work, that voters also want solutions to these issues. They need validation from local politicians, and that Democrats really need to talk about their policies in terms of the freedom frame and propose ideas that show these movable voters that the Democratic agenda is to create more opportunity for them. Explain a little bit about how these insights came about and what you saw in your discussions and why these are the messages and frames that work.
with Future Majority, we've done a lot of different message testing on freedom, on a whole variety of ways of looking at it, like the freedom to breathe clean air and drink clean water, the freedom to start a family, the freedom to marry the person of your choice, and looking at different frames of personal freedom, economic freedom, and foundational freedom, which is about democracy and living in free societies. And part of it is just we've been looking at sort of the right way. The right has co-opted the word freedom very effectively in recent years, and it was sort of the cornerstone of Ron DeSantis's sort of rise, and it's sort of when he was the darling of right-wing media in 2021 and 2022. But freedom is a value that Republicans have prioritized and that they associate with them. And there's so much history in talking about freedom from a progressive Democratic point of view, starting with FDR's For Freedom speech in, I think it was 1944. And we wanted to find ways to talk about freedom in a way that is going to resonate and that Democratic voters sort of see in themselves and value it more. So it's not that Republicans are clubbing themselves, sort of clubbing us as there for freedom and we're not. And it's been made easier after the Dobbs decision to talk about freedom in a way, because you can't be for freedom and then also be for abortion bans. You can't be for freedom and also for banning books. And it's a way, like, we've already seen that people associate Democrats more with personal freedom and seeing that more. And that's the value that, and a higher value with Democratic voters. The challenge has been the economic freedom part. Republicans are still seen as the party that will give you more economic freedom, more choices in your life. And there's ways we can talk about, like lowering healthcare costs, which will allow people freedom to move to different jobs. Education and improved education gives people more opportunities in their life. And it's sort of a way of talking about freedom that encompasses all different ways people view politics and what they want out of government. And one of the things I think one of the key findings from this poll is sort of the intersection of freedom and extremism. And movable voters in particularly largely view Republicans as more extreme than Democrats by almost a 5-to-1 margin. And sort of using that opportunity, when we ask people, like, which group do you think is most likely to take away your freedom, Republicans or Democrats, more likely to limit your freedoms, and more likely to end democracy, people see Republicans now, at least the young movable voters, as much more likely to take away these freedoms and limit them. I think we split form that and asked it from who's most likely to protect your freedom to vote, protect democracy, protect your freedoms. That is, people see the Democrats as more likely to do that, but not quite at the same level. And if we're going to make this election something larger than just a retrospective, the election is going to be a retrospective referendum on who ran the economy better, Joe Biden or Donald Trump from 2017 to 2019, because apparently in their world, 2020 and COVID doesn't count. That's going to be a harder election for us to win than making this election much larger about the type of America that we want to live in. And in terms of, we've been testing lots of different messages on the For the People frame and pairing that directly against how basically Make America Great Again, Build the Wall message that Republicans have. And part of what we have found is that when we frame For the People and what we support, the movables break to us by 3-4-1, as opposed to the straight MAGA message. The decided voters are more likely to break to the MAGA message. And when we tested a specific message on 5 freedoms for children, which encompass the freedom to be healthy, the freedom to be economically secure, the freedom to learn, the freedom from hunger, the freedom to be safe from harm, that gets 56% would support a candidate who says that versus 21% who support making America great again by getting inflation under control, getting people back to work, cracking down on crime, banning critical race theory, and securing the border. And that particular frame was created by Senator Bob Casey of Pennsylvania. So it's a way not only of talking about freedom in the America we want to live in, but putting it in the context of children. And again, when you're talking about children, you're talking about the future and which party is going to build not only a stronger future for children, but also give them more rights and more power and more freedom than people have had before.
Yeah, that's one of the questions we often get is how do you frame something? What is framing? And what it seems to me is the simplest way to explain it is that you describe your policies not in terms of just policy, but as an underlying value, as something people really care about and consider a part of their identity, like freedom, which is one of the main values that Americans think of when they think of what the country means. And so in this research you've done, you show how very specific issues tie to that freedom framework can be framed within the value of freedom. And things that these movable voters are concerned about include the Supreme Court being turned into an extremist organization that's going to take away more rights than it already has. Reproductive freedom, the big attack we've seen on abortion rights, on birth control, on IVF now. And the really big one that seems kind of absurd and scary that we have to talk about is the idea that Republicans might end democracy, and we may not have a country that functions the way it traditionally has. And so we have to talk about all of those things, but make sure that people know we're talking about freedom at the same time. Is that kind of capture it, or is there something else you would say there in terms of how to talk about these things, how to frame them for the
I think
voters?
that's right. I think that's right. The key thing is always like, I think for every candidate has to answer this simple question is like, where do you want America to go and how do you get there? And then put your policies into a narrative that leads voters along and that being the place that they want to go to. And then also contrasting that with what the other side wants to do. So do you want women to be able to have choices over when to start a family and who they can marry? Or do you want to restrict what they can do? And I think it's more than an issue, but particularly with Dobbs and reproductive freedom, it's about if someone supports these bans, what other things are they going to support and implement, and what type of America will result from that? And I think what we're seeing is like it's very hard when you ban abortion, you're going to have situations where a state Supreme Court is going to say, oh, in vitro fertilization is we have to put that on hold, that discarding embryos is killing a child, which is not actually what it is. But it's just like, it's very hard when you go that direction to not go further. Like if you're going to say, well, we're going to ban abortion in Alabama or Missouri, it's just like, we're also going to, I guess we're just going to have to block the roads to keep people from going to another state to receive abortion care. And if we're going to sort of devolve everything to the states and allow things like loosening child labor laws and abortion bans, like that is ultimately, we're seeing how things are playing out of the one vision of American life versus what Democrats and progressives hold, which is you have more freedom to live your life how you want without restrictive government policies and more opportunities for success because we're investing in education. We're trying to lower the cost of healthcare, lower the cost of prescription drugs, and make America a better place for you to live and raise a family.
One of the surprising things about this research, and I think it's a question a lot of people have, it seems like these younger movables have a very low opinion of the Republican Party. A large majority think Republicans are more likely to take away your freedom to vote, most more likely to limit your freedoms. They think that Republicans are a lot more likely to end democracy. How could people view the Republican Party and its agenda so negatively, so anti-freedom, and yet still have a question about for whom to vote? What's the rationale there? How would you explain this to people who don't know how there could be a question between voting for Biden or voting for Republicans?
I think the data that we present in this survey, it's fairly easy to see. The movables don't really have a favorable view of Biden. His favorable rating is fairly low. The same thing for Kamala Harris. It is much stronger and more intensely negative to Trump. But I think the thing we have to sort of realize, particularly you and I who follow politics on a day-to-day, minute-to-minute basis, um, people have not engaged with this presidential contest at all. And part of what the great things about campaigns are, it does give each candidate the opportunity to present their vision for the future and contrast with the other side. The Biden campaign has barely begun. They've spent a fraction of what they're going to spend on their message. And it is challenged because it's like you're voting for a set of policies, you're also voting for a person. And it takes a while to make people particularly comfortable with the choice that they have, especially since there have been challenges throughout Biden's entire term. We've been coming out of COVID. We had very high inflation for a while that has come down, but has still been exceedingly disruptive. We have multiple wars in Ukraine and in Gaza that are horrifying on all different levels. And it's just very hard with the media environment the way it is, with it's fractured the way it is, a Congress that's actively doing nothing and scuttling any possible positive thing that could happen, whether it's on the border or in Ukraine. And campaigns will allow a choice to become clearer that doesn't really sort of exist now within how things are being governed. And like any race with an incumbent, like essentially the challenger has two questions they need to answer. Is there a reason for the incumbent to be removed? Which, I mean, there's lots of reasons people would have and things that they don't like about Joe Biden, including many people who are going to be voting for Joe Biden. And is the other candidate an acceptable alternative? And people can come to answer the first question very easily and very early on in a campaign. They don't really answer the second question until much later. And that's part of what we're going to have to do. Not only the Biden campaign, but all the Democratic campaigns at every level, from state legislature to county commissioner. It's going to be the type of election where their work, their door-to-door contacts, they're reaching and talking to voters, they're advertising about what makes them a Democrat, how their vision for their community and the Democratic vision will lead to better outcomes. And almost like a lot of the turnout and messaging has to come from the bottom up rather than the top down for this election. And we could go through a lot of reasons why that would be. It's just what it is. Yeah. And move people to Biden and the Democrats that way, as opposed to relying on an Obama-like inspiring speech, which is just not where people are right now.
Yeah, well, they say all politics is local, right? So there's a degree to which you do have to have that local buy-in, people who are trusted and are supported by people in cities and counties and states transferring that allegiance to the president. One of the things on that point that I found very interesting, because it does seem like part of the problem is there is a lack of inspiration on both sides. But in the end, people will have to make a choice. Do you want the very bad thing to happen, or do you want the good enough thing to happen? Do you want to vote to keep our freedoms with the Democratic Party, or do you want to vote to maybe lose them and have a whole different version of America that looks nothing like the democracy that we've enjoyed for a while here? But one of the things I found is there are some inspirational figures in the Democratic Party who kind of score off the charts in some important states. Gretchen Whitmer, I think in the poll, had support or positive feelings from these movable voters.
10% of the young movables in Michigan have a favorable opinion of her. I think it's like Barack and Michelle Obama, like with movables, their favorable is over 50% higher than Biden and Kamala's are. Like you could sort of drown in all these bad Biden polling numbers that are out there. But the one thing you sort of have to, it's not really translating to all Democrats. And within states like Josh Shapiro with movables, fairly popular. Mark Kelly in Arizona, and it's going to have to be up to different surrogates in different places that are effectively making the case not only for Biden but also for um, Democratic policies. I will say that Gavin Newsom on Meet the Press this weekend was a very, very effective spokesperson for the Democratic Party um, nationally and for the Biden administration. I think there definitely needs to be more of that. He's not quite as popular with the movable California voters as Gretchen Whitmer is in Michigan, but it's going to take everybody at every level to win, every Democrat at every level to win this election. It can't just fall just on the Biden campaign.
As a pollster, how are you feeling going into this? Optimistic, pessimistic, don't know yet. What's your gut feeling on this one, Stephen?
Um, it's weird. It's normally I look at numbers, and if I see bad numbers, I react negatively to them. And I'm usually pessimistic because pollsters are supposed to be the person throwing cold water in the room. That it's like, here's what the reality is, and here's how we need to get to the next step. And if you're overly optimistic and wrong, that's about the worst thing you can be as a pollster. And when you work in Democratic politics for so long, you forget the wins and remember the losses. But it's like, I look at this data objectively, and yeah, I just saw another batch of swing state polls from a company I've never heard of that's in UK that Biden is down pretty much everywhere, except ironically in Michigan, the one state everyone's obsessed with. And like yesterday, Bloomberg and Morning Consult came out with a bunch of negative polls in swing states, and sort of look at them, and it's just like, for an incumbent president, they're sort of in a state we've never seen before. But then it's sort of, you look in the poll, and it's just like, okay, Biden's down 6 in Nevada, but he's up by 7 with white votes, up by 7 points with white voters, and losing Hispanic voters 70-25. And it's like, you look at this data on one level, it makes sense. You go deeper, it doesn't make sense. And then history really isn't a guide. It's when you look at consumer confidence during administrations, usually the presidents who preside over big declines lose, like George H.W. Bush and Jimmy Carter and Donald Trump. Those who preside over big gains in their time, they win, like Bill Clinton and Barack Obama and Ronald Reagan. George W. Bush had a slight decline, but it was all, consumer confidence was pretty high, and it's throughout his first term. And Biden, consumer confidence now is exactly what it was when the day Biden was inaugurated. And we haven't had since the late 1800s a president running against a former president, a president who's running against a former president who's clearly deranged, who can't really form complete ideas in his speeches. He was talking yesterday about all the languages invading the country and languages no one speaks. And
He's
but
selling
it's
the
also
ugly
like,
shoes, the clown shoes he's selling
yeah,
now. It's very strange.
the clown shoes. He's raised much less money so far than he did 4 years ago. More of that money is going to fight all of his court battles. He's going to have to come up with $83 million for Eugene Carroll in a week. And it's just like, I think the only thing is we have to look at this. Like, this election hasn't started yet. It's going to be very weird. We don't have clear guideposts. And the polling right now is telling us one thing, but that isn't necessarily what the election is going to be at the end of the year, especially given how post-Dobbs Democrats have been consistently outperforming polling.
If you could be in the room for 1 minute with President Biden, Vice President Harris, and their campaign team as they get ready for 2024, what would you tell them in a nutshell?
Focus on what you want America to be in 4 years, where you tell as simple, a clear of a story of why your presidency, your administration matters, how it's going to matter to people, what specifically you are doing to improve people's lives. The one thing that movables found believable about the Biden record is capping insulin and ending surprise healthcare costs, much more so than any recitation of economic statistics. So focus on what you want to do for the American people, be as specific as possible, don't assume people necessarily know what you're talking about when about IRA and Build Back Better, finish the job. Be very, very clear and succinct about the type of America you want us all to live in and why that is ultimately better than the hellscape Republicans want us to live in.
Freedom for the people 2024 or not. The choice is yours. Stephen, thanks for joining us and hope you'll join us again sometime as this campaign year goes on.
Thank you, Gil. Anytime.
And now we're going to go over into the FrameLab, where we're going to have a little discussion about this poll with Dr. George Lakoff, the co-founder and co-author of FrameLab. Hey, George, how you doing?
As well as could be expected.
Well, going into 2024, it looks like we're going to have to dust off the podcast and do some more episodes. This might be our last chance to podcast for a while, depending on who wins this election. A lot at stake.
Yes. Boy, is there ever.
So the future majority poll that we've reviewed and that I just talked to Stephen Clermont about says that Democrats need to frame their agenda in terms of freedom and being
Yes.
for the people. And this is a
Right.
strong validation for what you've been saying and writing for decades. You've said that Democrats need to use the freedom frame, that freedom is the most important value in American politics, and that Democrats need to describe their agenda as being for the people.
And there's
So,
this book that I wrote called Whose Freedom?
yeah, you wrote an entire book on it. And now it's become very popular. I mean, we wrote about this last year. The Democrats had some pollsters who said, wow, when you talk about things in terms of freedom, it seems to have a big effect on voters. Americans really dig and are affected by this freedom frame. So tell us again. I know you've written about it. We've talked about it before, I think, on the podcast, but why are freedom and for the people so powerful in the minds of the American voter?
Because that's what America is based on. The whole idea of the country is based on freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom to live your life in all the reasonable ways. The entire country is based on the idea of freedom. And that's often not appreciated enough. But if you look at the types of freedom, the freedom to earn a living, the freedom to vote, just just think of all of the ways in which you are, the freedom to go across state lines or to drive your car or to do anything you want to do. I mean, this is a major issue. The country is based on the idea of freedom. There's economic freedom, there's personal freedoms, and so on.
If freedom is the most important value in American politics and in the American psyche, then we have to talk about the fact that there seem to be different definitions of what freedom is. And the way Republicans define freedom, and they're the ones constantly framing things in terms of freedom and the flag and being more American than everyone else, in many ways is a curtailment of the freedoms of many people. It's a very limited view of freedom. As your book is titled, Whose Freedom? That's the big question here. So tell us a bit about the Republican definition of freedom and what it is and what it's not.
Okay, for Republicans, freedom is being free to enrich yourself, to make yourself more powerful, and to get things. That is for yourself. For Democrats, freedom has to do with empathy and with caring about all sorts of other people and other communities as well as yourself. And that's a fundamental difference. Is this about self-interest or is this about caring about everybody's interest? That's, a fundamental difference between Republicans and Democrats. And it's never said. That is, why would you care about the rights of underserved communities? Very important thing, because you have empathy for them, not because you're involved in your self-interest. That's the big difference between Republicans and Democrats. Democracy, the very notion of democracy, is based on empathy, caring about other people. That's what democracy is about. It's about caring not just about your own self-interest, but caring about other people, and and that's not very well understood. Republicans don't think in terms of empathy. One of the big differences between Democrats and Republicans has to do with what do you fundamentally think about empathy or not?
Why do Democrats have such a hard time talking about this? Republicans are always using moral arguments and freedom arguments to make the case for their very restrictive and somewhat tyrannical political beliefs. Why don't Democrats frame the ter the terms of the debate? Why can't they pull it off? Even though their own polls show they got to talk about freedom constantly, they got to talk about being for the people, and yet they just sort of trail off into a thousand different directions. I know this is a problem you've been highlighting and attempting to remedy for a long time, but what's the problem there? What's the holdup with Democrats?
They believe in Descartes. They think that this is about simply arguing rationally. It's not about how people understand themselves emotionally as well as rationally. So, if you just believe in, the rational actor model, then you're going to miss everything. And that a lot of Democrats simply believe in the rational actor model. Let's have a policy and follow it rationally, rather than understand what the policy means emotionally for people as well as rationally. They miss that, you know, um, what has been called Descartes' error. You know, they think it's all a matter of rationality and rational argument, not about what people feel, and they miss that feeling part.
Mhm. And the poll was pretty clear that Democrats have to stop thinking that lists of policies are somehow going to convince anybody or mean anything. And of course,
Right.
these are all things that you written and don't think of an elephant in the political brain. In most of your books, you've talked about this. It seems one of the terrifying things, it seems to me, over the developments of the Trump years, and now that we have the more full-blown authoritarian Republican Party saying the quiet part out loud, is how much this is all very unfortunately and tragically validated what you've been saying for decades. I mean, I wish it were not so.
Yeah.
But a lot of the people who thought that, oh, it's stupid that there's two different versions of freedom, or the idea that Republicans have a hierarchical belief system is ridiculous. This is all really clear now. It's you got to be stupid not to see it, or willfully denying it. And so we're seeing that this list of policies isn't going to do the trick. And what we see is that with these young movable voters in the poll, they aren't impressed by the Democratic Party, unfortunately. They don't
Yeah.
see a bright future for themselves. They're very prone to some third party promises or else apathy. And they're not necessarily biconceptuals. They're not necessarily moderates. They're pretty progressive and pretty young, but they don't feel inspired. But this is going to be an election where we're making a huge choice between whether to stay a democracy or whether to become an authoritarian version of America, which is really no America at all. What would you say, as someone who's had a lot of students, who's talked to a lot of young people most of your life, to these young, movable voters who don't feel inspired and don't know how they're going to vote in 2024?
Well, first of all, what do you care about? And is what you care about dependent upon your identity? That is, are you voting on identity politics, or is there some other reason, what we'll call moral politics? Is there a general notion of morality behind it? And a lot of people are voting their identity, as opposed to voting sort of general moral principles or things of that sort. And that's a hard thing to sort out for people. Most people never think about these issues. They just go about their lives. They don't think about how they actually, what is behind the way they vote or feel they're going to vote, what is behind what they support, what they're enthusiastic about, or what they're outraged about. And it can be identity, their own identity. It can be a certain moral view. and they're different.
Well, the poll showed that these young movable voters are very, very moved by arguments related to freedom, and they view the Republican Party as more likely to take away freedom and even to end democracy.
Right.
And is that enough of an issue? Should that be the singular issue you vote on for these young
I think
voters?
I think that's true. I think it should be. There's an issue about freedom, and the question is, what kind of freedom is it? And there are people who say, well, look, freedom is freedom is freedom, period. You know, and that's not true. I mean, there is economic freedom, the freedom to earn a living, and and so on. There is freedom to live where you want to live. That is, can you get housing in certain places, or are you redlined, and so on. Uh, there are all kinds of versions of freedom where people don't notice that these are freedom issues. The freedom to just, get a place to live where you want to live. That's, not an obvious thing. There are plenty of places where not just anybody can move in.
The question of the future is a big one. And the poll shows that Democrats can't just make this about Trump and how bad Trump is. They have to talk proactively about how the future will be different under a Democratic agenda than under a Trump, MAGA, Putin Republican agenda. What
Mhm.
are the differences between those two futures that you see? If voters decide that we're going to go with Trump again, how is the future going to be different than where it would be with Biden?
Well, with Trump, basically, money is going to be a big deal in determining who has power in the society. Whereas if you go with Biden, uh, the middle class, ordinary folks are going to have more power. They're going to have power that you wouldn't have under Trump. And that's a big deal. That is, who has what sorts of power to determine how they're going to live, where they're going to live, what jobs they can get, and so on. I mean, there are a lot of issues in society like that, and they're different under Trump versus Biden. And people don't understand what those differences are. There isn't a nice list of differences that where you can go down the list and say, this one is important to me, you know. Uh, and that I think one needs that kind of list. I think you need to be able to say, what is important to me and what's on this list of what would be different. And it would be useful to have a list like that.
What advice would you give to the Biden campaign as we head into the next few months of this pivotal and possibly highly consequential election?
All right. Forget the notion of Bidenomics. No one's going to understand that. No one's going to understand what that is in terms of their lives. You know, Biden is, you want to have, again, short lists of how these things matter in people's lives. What are you free to do that you, A, need to do or really want to do to live your life? And that depends a lot on who you are and what your identity is and so on. What for ordinary folks versus or rich folks. Rich folks have certain freedoms that ordinary folks don't. Money gives them that. You know, how can government change that? And it can change it in all sorts of ways. And that's what the Biden administration is trying to do to make, jobs more available, to make, ability to get enough to eat, to live your life, to live where you want to live, etc., available to ordinary people versus rich people. That is, take the power away from being rich to just being a citizen. And And that is, not an easy thing to do, and that's what the Biden administration is trying to do. And the Biden administration is not very good about telling people this. They're not very good about explaining what Biden is about.
Well,
You know,
they did say last year that the campaign was going to be about freedom, but then they have proceeded to not really talk about freedom on a daily basis. They seem to
right,
think that they can just pop up every once in a while and say the word freedom, and then that somehow everybody remembers that that's what it's about. But it really does take a more strenuous and continuous effort to get the frame across, doesn't it? And this is not just surface framing, this is deep framing we're talking about. And so
right,
to achieve that deep framing, they have to be out there, everything every day the president has to be talking about freedom. Every opportunity he gets has to be about freedom. And
right.
I don't know what it's going to take to get this through their heads. Their own polls show it. Other polls show it. It's understood that this is important. How can we get the Democrats to do what's in the best interests of the country so that, in terms of framing this as freedom, so that voters who are undecided can do the same thing? Is there anything that can be done?
Yes, the answer is what matters to you, and are you free to do what matters to you? And if not, what are the limitations on that freedom and what can be done about it by government? That was what, 12 words or something?
Yeah. And talk a little bit about the importance of for the people. You've often said that. It's in
Yeah.
Lincoln, right? A government of the people, by the
Oh,
people, for the people. That's another phrase that you had pulled out a few
yeah,
years ago as an important frame. I think Kamala Harris adopted that in her campaign, for the people.
yes.
And what does it mean? And what does it mean to be for the people in terms of a political?
First of all, it means that you don't have to be rich. Number one, you don't have to have influence that wealth gives you. That ordinary, non-rich folks can do that. You don't have, you can be in underserved communities. You can be Black, you can be Hispanic, whatever, and have the same opportunities. That's what for the people means, whoever you are. That is, your race isn't going to matter, your income isn't going to matter. You as a citizen have certain freedoms,
Mhm.
and you should be able to get a decent job and have enough to feed your family and so on. At least that, and have a future for yourself and your children.
Mhm.
Uh, Very simple things. What resources are there for everybody, and and society offers a lot of resources, and the question is who gets them? How are those resources made available to people? That's what for the people it's about. That is, ordinary folks versus rich and influential folks.
That's it for this episode of the FrameLab podcast. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. And for sharp analysis delivered straight to your inbox, please subscribe to the FrameLab newsletter at www.theframelab.org.